If you'll bear with us for one moment, we'll be starting the grand opening ceremony. Just 1 second.
Good afternoon. The Civil War probably was the most profound event that happened in American history. And there have been a number of people over a number of years who've talked about the Civil War. And I think, in my mind, one of the best quotes to relate to the Civil War came from Mark Twain, or Samuel Clemens, in which he said, "The war uprooted institutions that were centuries old, transformed the social life of half of the country, and wrought so profoundly upon the entire national character that the influence cannot be measured short of 2 or 3 generations." If he would have lived longer, he probably would have said 7, 8, 9, or 10 generations. What we commemorate here at Manassas are 2 great battles of the Civil War, and what we are commemorating here today was the first battle of Manassas, which was the first major battle of the Civil War. We have tried to include a number of things in this exhibit that may not be traditional for a Civil War battlefield. And one of the things that we have done that is a little bit more traditional is to include quotes from many of the soldiers that were here. And let me just give you a little couple of examples here. One soldier from New Hampshire, just before the first Battle of Manassas started, said, "We are all well and feeling first rate, longing for the drum to sound that bids us into victory or death. We shall take Manassas or die before tomorrow night. I never felt better in my life. I fear death as much as I fear the sting of the bee." Now, after the battle was over, they changed their tune a little bit. And let me read one from a Georgia soldier shortly after the Battle of First Manassas. He said, "I felt that I was in the presence of death. My first thought was, this is unfair. Somebody is to blame for getting us all killed. I didn't come out here to fight this way. I wish the earth would crack open and let me drop in." So these are some of the emotions that we're trying to capture in the exhibit. And as you go through, you might want to look at some of the quotes that we have. The main purpose of the exhibit here is not so much to have an exhibit that people will come to as a destination, but the main purpose is to provide a context so that as you, our visitors, come here, you will have an understanding of what you see when you go out onto the field. You will know what happened on Henry Hill, for example. You will know what happened at Stonehouse. You will know what happened on the battlefield. And really the main purpose that we have here is to preserve and protect this battlefield as a national park. And with that, I would like to introduce to you Kent Brinkley, who is the Virginia chapter president of the American Society of Landscape Architects.
Thank you very much. And I want to welcome all of you this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm going to make my remarks very brief. I would like to make an introduction and have our national president, who's with us today, to describe the program that we have for our centennial year. Our society, the American Society of Landscape Architects, is 100 years old this year. And one of the reasons why we're here today is to present a award, a recognition to Manassas Battlefield Park. And I would like to introduce to you, just to describe a little bit about the program, Mr. Barry Stark, who is also a native Virginian, and he just happens to be the national president of the American Society of Landscape Architects, and we're very pleased and proud of that fact that a native Virginian is leading our society this year. So Barry?
Thank you, Kit. It's a very special treat to be here today as the national president of ASLA and to recognize the Civil War battlefields in Virginia and the National Park Service. As Kit said, this is the 100th anniversary of the American Society of Landscape Architects. What started 100 years ago as 12 members is now over 13,000 strong throughout the United States. And throughout most of this history, we have had a very strong bond with the National Park Service. And we have assisted the Park Service in planning and designing parks, in protecting our natural and cultural heritage, and in general making this country a more livable place. What's particularly interesting about being here today that not many people know, there's a fact that even not many landscape architects know, that Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., who was later to become known as the founder of the profession of landscape architecture in America, actually participated here in 1861 in the Battle of First Manassas. Not as a soldier, not as a reporter, which he had formerly been, and not as a spectator who had come out to see the Union soldiers whip the Rebs, but he was here as the director of the U.S. Sanitary Commission. The U.S. Sanitary Commission is the predecessor of the American Red Cross. You may know that, but Olmsted, following the Battle of First Manassas, conducted one of the most comprehensive studies about the effects of stress in the battlefield on soldiers that's ever been conducted. And he laid the groundwork for the Sanitary Commission and went on to run the commission for several years during the Civil War, putting together a fleet of hospital ships that operated in and out of the Chesapeake Bay and Pamunkey River. And it's probably a little better known that his son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., was one of the real movers and shakers in the formation of the National Park Service. So it's particularly interesting that history brings us back together here today. In celebration of our 100th anniversary, the American Society of Landscape Architects decided to undertake a program which recognizes the most significant landscapes, the most significant works of landscape architecture throughout the country. We call this our Medallions program. The program began as nominations from our 47 local chapters across the country, with final selection of the medallion winners by the national organization. And I'm very pleased and proud to say that the Civil War battlefields, parks in Virginia, and the National Park Service are the recipient of one of these awards, of which there are only 361 throughout the country. So with that, I will let Kent Brinkley take the podium again and explain to you the nomination of this specific award. Thank you.
I'm going to be very brief and just read the just portions of the nomination, just because I think it says something about the significance of this place, not just for its history, but for the fact that this place has been preserved and it's been planned, and there's been a great deal of thought and energy and effort that's been put into creating this park for citizens to enjoy, not only for its history, but also for recreation and other things. That Virginia is the home to more battlefields than any other state in the country may explain the passion with which the state and private citizens here have pursued the preservation of the state's historical legacy of farms, cemeteries, and battlefields. It has been the transformation over time of many of the more important of these various sites into a unified collection of landscapes by the National Park Service, which continues to have a major impact upon the appearance of the Virginia landscape today. For the last century, many state, local, and private agencies have been engaged in the struggle to preserve many of Virginia's battlefields, but the resources which have been devoted to this purpose by the federal government has had the most lasting impact and attest to the perceived national significance of these places. In the early to mid-1900s, the federal government began acquiring these sites and commenced the process of their historical documentation of actions and conflicts that had occurred in specific locations. Site stabilization and preservation followed, often as public works projects. Many of these became New Deal projects that were completed by the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, during President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration. One of the early National Park Service landscape architects who worked on the design of new public access roads, interpretive signs, and so forth to mark these important sites was a gentleman by the name of Dave Schmidt. It was the design of these rustic first public contact stations which helped to establish an overall vernacular design style within the National Park Service system for all Civil War battlefield parks in particular. The transformation over time of these various sites by the Park Service into unified collections of landscapes has presented a challenge to design professionals to maintain the nationwide standards of the National Park Service while protecting and preserving the individual meaning and character of each park unit. The complex nature of these sites demands many layers of professional design, planning, and preservation services, restoring 19th century land patterns and features, as well as carefully integrating non-historic amenities such as paths, roadway systems, wayside exhibits, directional and interpretive signs, visitor centers, which you see here today, and parking areas requires balancing the physical and visual assets of the various parks with the Park Service's educational and interpretive goals. As Abraham Lincoln stated in his Gettysburg Address, "The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated this place far beyond our poor power to add or detract. The world will little not nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here." This statement could certainly apply to all battlefields, but it is quite apparent that it applies to Manassas Battlefield, and it's apparent that Virginians have clearly not forgotten. So the Virginia chapter of the American Society of Landscape Architects great pride in nominating the Manassas Battlefield Park for recognition by the award of an ASLA Centennial Medallion to be presented to the National Park Service for their major efforts to preserve and protect this important American landscape of sacrifice and memory. We have a certificate to present. I'll ask Mr. Sutton if you'd come forward, please. It says the Manassas National Battlefield Park, National Park Service, United States Department of the Interior. In recognition of the national significance of Manassas National Battlefield Park, the efforts of the National Park Service, its partners, and landscape architects for securing and protecting this national historic site, commemorating the place where two major battles of the American Civil War were fought, as a sacred site that honors the bravery of thousands of men who fought here, and as a cultural landscape worthy of the prestigious and distinguished ASLA Centennial Medallion Award. Mr. Sutton, on behalf of the American Society of Landscape Architects, it gives us great pleasure to present this award to you. We hope that you will display it proudly so that the public may see that this is truly a significant American landscape.
Thank you very much.
There is a bronze plaque that comes with this, and I'm going to ask Barry if he'll stand up here and make this presentation. This is a seal from the Society logo, and it says ASLA Centennial Medallion, the American Society of Landscape Architects, 1899 to 1999. This site is recognized as a national landmark for outstanding landscape architecture.
Thank you, Sutton. On behalf of the ASLA National, we present you with the Centennial Medallion.
Thank you so much. I'm going to put these right here so you can see them, but please don't carry them away. We are proud not only to reopen our visitor center today, but to officially open our new bookstore. Eastern National joined with us about a year ago by contributing a significant amount of their funds to erect a new bookstore on the back of our visitor center. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think we now can boast that we have the most comprehensive Civil War bookstore in the Washington, D.C. area. And so I would like to greet and thank George Minucci, the president of Eastern National.
Thank you, Bob. Regional Director Carlson, Congressman Jackson, distinguished guests, friends, and park visitors. It's an honor to be here. We are very happy to have been a participant in this renovation. Eastern National is a nonprofit cooperating association that provides educational and informative materials to park visitors and the general public. As a partner to the National Park Service and its interpretive programs, any profits that are derived from the sale of our products are returned to the parks as donations. The staff of Manassas National Battlefield Park has done a tremendous job in preserving and protecting this historic site commemorating 2 battles, so that future generations may enjoy it. Eastern National takes great pride in assisting the Park Service carrying out its mission. Thank you, Bob.
Am I correct in saying that the bookstore, the sales of the bookstore essentially have paid for your contribution at this point?
Not quite, but
Half. End of the year it will have paid for it. There are so many people who've been involved with this process that I could be here for an hour going on. Do you really want to be here for an hour and have me describe everybody? No. There are several that I absolutely have got to recognize, though, because they've been so important to the success of this project. The exhibits that you see in the building were designed by a company, MFM, and I believe that Beth Miles is not here, but she was the M of MFM. Is Beth here? She said she may or may not. We all left here very late last night, so I'm not sure whether she was awake or not. Also, a company did the interior renovations. It was called Prince Construction. In the midst of this whole process, it became Marco Construction. They did a wonderful job finishing the interior of the building, and about a week ago they came in on kind of on an emergency to help us finish up another project that was just not going anywhere. So I believe Larry Bolin is here. Well, I'm not doing so well. Maybe someone will be here that I can recognize. Also, I do know that the other company is here, Colorad, which is our neighbors. Colorad is literally across I-66, within about 5 minutes of the park. Colorad did the magnificent job of fabricating and installing all of the new exhibits that you see. And Dave Belke and Donnie are both here. We're very fortunate. They've done a number of exhibits for the National Park Service. Every time they do an exhibit, they call up and say, do you want to come and see what another park's getting? So we were getting very jealous. And so finally they got the contract to do this exhibit, and they said, well, why don't you just wait until we put it in the building? Okay, fine. And we're absolutely thrilled with it. Dave Belke, the president of Colorad, has a very long history with Manassas Battlefield. If you walk into their headquarters, the first thing you see is the uniform that he wore in 1961 as a Confederate reenactor in probably the greatest reenactment ever, which was the first Battle of Manassas in 1961 to commemorate the centennial of the Civil War. So he's had a long association with this battlefield. Now, none of this would have been possible without the help of our wonderful Harpers Ferry Center of the National Park Service. Gary Cummins wanted to be here in the worst way. He is the director of the Harpers Ferry Center. He could not make it today, but there are a number of people who are here. Mary Herber and Cindy Darr are the branch chiefs, right? Division chiefs, I'm sorry. Boy, I went one step too low here. Division chiefs of the exhibit division, and they really helped us get this whole thing together. They hired a contractor for us to develop the exhibits. They oversaw all parts of the exhibit. They had to put up with a lot of really bad stuff from us because we kept correcting things, but we had, I think, a wonderful partnership putting this exhibit together. Brian Jones, the director of the audiovisual division, put together all of the graphics, all of the moving images, the sound, and they did a wonderful job. Martin Burke and his staff took the artifacts out of the building about a year ago. It takes a year to prepare artifacts for exhibit. And so over the past year, all of the artifacts that used to be in the building and in storage have been lovingly cared for and prepared for this exhibit. And so the artifacts you see have gone through a lot of conservation over the last year. And finally, Joanne Grove and Sheila Jordan actually took everything and kind of put it together. They were the contracting officer, and Sheila was the contracting officer's technical representative, and we went through a little bit, but everything got done, and it's a wonderful job, and we absolutely could not do it without the help of the Harpers Ferry Center. And finally, the staff of Manassas Battlefield Park literally made everything possible. I think I'm probably the most fortunate superintendent. Is there any superintendent here besides me? Good. I have got to be the most fortunate superintendent there is because I have a staff that is incomparable. To give you an example, we left, many of us left last night about 10 o'clock, came back early this morning. The women's restroom was not working. Within an hour, we had it together and had it working. And that it really is thanks to our staff. And I am just very fortunate to have such a wonderful staff. So staff, are they here? Anybody here?
They're all over the place.
They're all over the place. Thank you. I think I already said finally, but let me say finally again. I would also, none of this would have been possible without the help of our regional office. And today we have a number of people from our regional office. Terry Carlstrom, the regional director, Gentry Davis, deputy regional director, formerly my boss at National Capital Parks East. And at this time I'd like to introduce Terry Carlstrom, who is helping us celebrate today.
Well, I was going to speak for an hour on thanking everyone, but Superintendent Sutton, you took care of that. But I'd like to extend my personal thanks to each and every one of you that made it all possible. And Congressman Jackson, pleasure to have you here with us today. You've been here several times in the past. You visited several of our battlefields throughout the National Park Service. And, well, it's just great to have you here with us. And special guests, really appreciate the award, the medallion. I wasn't really aware we were going to receive that. The superintendent kept it from me, but he kept it from me very well, and it was a genuine surprise and greatly appreciated. And if you look out on this beautiful scene, the tent is oriented just right. You get a very beautiful panoramic view with very few intrusions. And thanks to a lot of the zoning that has taken place in the county, it's going to continue to look that way. Now, if you look real hard, you'll see a couple of towers out there, but...
No, you won't. Not that way you won't. Better not.
But in due time, technology will take care of those too, I am sure. So it's a pleasure for me to be here to celebrate the 138th anniversary of the First Battle of Manassas and the rededication of the Henry Hill Visitor Center. And I can tell you, I was here a couple of weeks ago, and I thought we were going to have a dedication of construction in progress and say it'll be done soon. And again, thanks to you, Superintendent Sutton, for an excellent job of bringing it all together. And I bring you the greetings of the Director of the National Park Service, who unfortunately can't be here today, Director Robert G. Stanton, who I occupy his old job. So the National Capital Region was well taken care of in the past. He actually, he actually started this project when he was still Regional Director, and it's my pleasure, along with the Superintendent, to see it through to completion. But it's been a big project, one that has taken more than 2 years to complete. Visitor Center is completely remodeled, and I think for those of you that have already looked at it, you will certainly agree that the results are magnificent. There were a few things that were pointed out to me that could be corrected, and we've looked at a couple of those, and we'll certainly give that some consideration. Everything isn't perfect the first time, but it certainly is very close to it. But in particular, the interpretive exhibits have been redone to reflect more than just the troop movements that occurred during the battle. They also concentrate on the reasons for the Civil War, the institution of slavery, and the impact of the conflict on civilians living here where the battle took place. Recently, at the site of the Portisi Mansion, how many of you know where that is? It's no longer there, but at that site, a few miles south of here, I think, am I right? I don't want to get into your geography again. We'll talk about it later. But they uncovered artifacts, some of which had been carried over from Africa. And it illustrated to us and helps us to understand how enslaved people lived and how they were affected by the war. In addition, a major excavation was done at the home site of a freed African American, and you all know who that was, James Robinson. His heirs continued to live in the area, and he lived in the middle of the battlefield. Well, it's over this way. Thank you. For those of you that didn't hear, he said I got it right. But there too, what we found when we did excavations, we found a wealth of artifacts pertaining to the domestic lifestyle of the Robinson family and many of the military artifacts that the family collected from the battlefield. You'll find all of these objects on display as you tour through the new visitor center, rededicated visitor center. We don't build new visitor centers in too many places in the Park Service these days. And as has been pointed out, there are many people to thank for this great and important project. I again want to say thank you to Eastern National for investing the funds that actually led to the remodeling of the bookstore. So once again, George, I'll call you George. I've known you for quite a while. It's been a real pleasure to work with you, and thanks again. And I just have to say my appreciation also goes to the National Park Service's Harpers Ferry Interpretive Design Center for the overall direction of this endeavor. And the individuals here we've already recognized, so my hat's off. I'm not wearing one. My hat's off to you. No, you look fine. Leave it on. But the regional office too lent a crucial support, and that's what we're all about, is working together as an organization. The regional office has been downsized somewhat, but we moved one of our people out here to assist in the construction of this project. And he works under the direction of our regional maintenance chief, Don Filsoof, who is not here today. And another person in the regional office who extended a lot of effort, the contracting officer, Mr. Tom McConnell, is not here today, but one individual is here today that I would just like to recognize, and you did a yeoman's job in pulling it all together. David Brown, if you wouldn't mind just standing up and giving you a hand too, Dave. Well, the last person, I've been kidding him here a little bit. I'm glad you're chuckling with me, because I have a lot of respect for him. But the last person, and not the least, I want to thank is what I would call our very own, your very own Superintendent Bob Sutton. His leadership on this project and his overall management of the park has been splendid. You can clap when I'm done. Bob, you really proved it once again that our trust in you and your dedicated staff is not misplaced. Thank you. Well, Manassas National Battlefield Park represents a very important part of our shared American memory. The Civil War produced more public monuments in our country than any other conflict. And we know these places are hallowed ground because of the cost in human sacrifice and suffering. The battle anniversary and the reopening of the Visitor Center remind us that our monuments are more than the sum of their metal and stone parts, more than bricks and mortar. They represent nothing less than our collective memory and vindication of our shared past. Thank you.
Terry, you mentioned James Robinson, and I see Richard, his great-great-grandson, sitting over here. Richard, we're so glad you could come here today, and have you had a chance to see the exhibit yet? See your great-great-grandfather's things? Well, they're in here. So this really is the first opportunity that James Robinson's am I correct, great-great-grandson will have an opportunity to see this wonderful exhibit. Also, Annie Snyder has been quite ill. I'm sure all of you know Annie Snyder. She called to say she was coming. I don't believe she was able to make it, but Annie Snyder, I mean, if she's not here, she must not, the weather or something must be keeping her away, because there are very few things that would keep Annie Snyder away from this opening. About a year and a half ago, I met Congressman Jessie Jackson when he brought his staff to Manassas Battlefield on a tour of some, I believe, 20 Civil War battlefields. We had a wonderful discussion about the Civil War. It was a very lively discussion, I would say, about the Civil War. And at the time he was here, we were in the beginning process of developing our exhibit. And after his visit, I pulled out some of the books I hadn't read for quite a while, and some books that were new that I hadn't read as well, and began to really think about what we were doing. I mean, are we really doing things like we should be doing them? Should we do things a little bit differently? And as I was reading, I came across a letter from Abraham Lincoln. He wrote this letter in September of 1862 to a group in Chicago. Now, this is not to connect, I know that you're from Chicago, it has nothing to do with your being from Chicago, but in this letter, Abraham Lincoln was talking about a group that went out from Washington, D.C., I believe after the Second Battle of Manassas. He doesn't refer to which battle. He called it Bull Run 2. This group came out from Washington under a flag of truce to bury the dead and care for the wounded after the Second Battle of Manassas. And President Lincoln wrote, "The rebels seized the blacks who went along to help and sent them into slavery." That really hit me. That made me recognize that although the war aims of the Union in First or Second Manassas were not really to abolish slavery, slavery was a very important part of the Civil War and of these two battles. And so we began to rethink what we were doing with the exhibit, and included a couple of exhibit panels that dealt with slavery and with the constitutional issues of sovereignty. And I thought, as I wrote this, that perhaps Congressman Jackson would like to add his comments to it. So I sent it to Congressman Jackson. He sent his comments back. And so the two exhibits you see as you walk into the museum are a collaborative effort dealing with slavery. So as we began to plan for this day, I felt that really the most appropriate person to come here and share in this experience was Congressman Jessie Jackson Jr. And so I'd like for you at this point to welcome him.
Let me first begin by expressing my great appreciation to Superintendent Dr. Bob Sutton for that very kind, very warm, very generous, very thoughtful, very provocative, very profound, and very truthful introduction. I came to first Manassas and then second Manassas in part to find what I believe every American who visits these sites throughout the country comes to find, and that is answers to questions about who we are, how we've developed as a nation, the kind of people that we have become, and indeed reflect and ponder upon where our nation is indeed going. I am one of those few people who happens to believe that the events that occurred on these various battle sites throughout the country have had such profound implications and impact on everything about who we are and who we will become, that it's often important that we stop and reflect upon it. But before I begin with my remarks, I do want to take this opportunity to thank the Secretary of the Interior, Secretary Bruce Babbitt, for his outstanding work and commitment to these battle sites, not only throughout the South, but those few sites that exist in the North. To Director Stanton in his absence, whom I had the great privilege of working with and discussing many of these ideas and thoughts. But most importantly, to Dr. Bob Sutton and the staff of this particular battle site, those members of the National Park Service who work so hard and who engage us in intellectual discussions, who engage our children, many of whom are not here today, but take field trips to this location. Sometimes they play devil's advocate on the side of the Union, other times they play devil's advocates on the side of the Confederacy. But whatever side they choose, in the final analysis, they are Americans, they are teachers, they are men and women who represent the very best that we have to offer in the federal government. Will you give those representatives of the Park Service who are here today an outstanding round of applause? Let's really hear it for them. Let's really hear it. I've got some prepared remarks that I wanted to read, but I'm going to set them aside because I think it most appropriate to share with you what I feel whenever I come to this battle site. Many of you see a young African American standing here, but I am a young African American congressman. I hail from the 2nd Congressional District of Illinois. I am a member of the House Appropriations Committee. That's the committee that funds the National Park Service. That's the committee that pays all of the guys around here with badges on. That's the committee that funds this park as well as other parks across our country. And so while I'm here as a young African American and a congressman, I'm also here in an official capacity because our committee in the Congress of the United States has oversight for these sites. When I was elected on December the 12th, 1995, I became the 91st African American to ever serve in the United States Congress. Number 91 out of 11,544 Americans who've had the privilege of serving in the United States Congress. Less than 103 have been African American since the very founding of our country. The first 22 African Americans were elected to Congress between 1870 and 1896, just 5 years after the Civil War, during the period known as Reconstruction, when the Union troops occupied many of the southern cities and states that had seceded from the Union. Those African Americans came to Congress full of hope, full of promise to rebuild and reconstruct an America where all Americans indeed would have the opportunity to participate. I stand and sit in the United States Congress today as a direct descendant of their efforts to make America better for all Americans. Whenever I come to this particular battlefield, or any battlefield for that matter, throughout the entire country, I can't help but stop and think about who I am. Just as those of you who are descendants of participants in this particular conflict often reflect upon what your great-great-great-grandfather or grandparents were thinking, we draw from them a sense of who we are today based upon those events. When I stand here, I can't help but think that the party for which I am now a member, the Democratic Party, was the party of Stonewall Jackson. It was the party of Robert E. Lee. It was the party of Jefferson Davis. It was the party that made the decision to secede from the Union because their states had a right to protect their private property interests. I can't help but think that when Abraham Lincoln was elected and before the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter under PGT Beauregard's leadership, that Abraham Lincoln, seeking to keep the Union together and stop the expansion of slavery westward, that the sentiments around the issue of slavery had run so deep during that time that we were headed along a course of becoming two separate and apart nations. Professor Sutton, there's not a day that goes by that I don't have to think about these particular events. In Chicago, and if ever you're there, please stop by my home and visit. I live at 2559 East 72nd Street. I had to drive through Grant Park, past Stephen Douglas's tomb, to Lincoln Park just to get to the Chicago Historical Society, the museum, to study critical issues that confront our nation. And through Camp Douglas. I don't want to ignore that reality in Chicago and in the North. But at the same time, I can't help but stop and reflect upon that which we have become as a nation. We are here today in part because, as one of the gentlemen stood here and said, we cannot consecrate this ground or this visitor center in better terms or in better ways than those who actually fought and died to make America better. This past 4th of July, when I stood in Lincoln Park speaking to many residents of that area about what it means to be an American, I had to reflect upon that. When we first separated ourselves from the colony when we separated ourselves from England during the Revolutionary War, to be a citizen of Virginia, to be a citizen of South Carolina, to be a citizen from Massachusetts was the overriding theme for which all Americans associated themselves. We were not a union of states because when we separated ourselves during the Revolutionary period, the federal government had not been formed. In a real sense, it was this war that transformed us from being a United States of America, that is, small u, our own state, I'm from Virginia, I'm from Chicago, that transformed us from being provincial in our approach to each other to being a national union of states. It really was Gettysburg when Abraham Lincoln stood there and substituted the Declaration of Independence for the Constitution by suggesting that all men and women are created equal and should be treated equally, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the face of the earth. And so when I see Americans on the 4th of July, Professor Sutton, waving the American flag, where there are 50 stars and stripes on that flag, they're not really celebrating our separation from the King of England, because taxation without representation is tyranny. If they're celebrating 50 stars that have joined together and found themselves in a union where no American should be left behind, they're really celebrating what Mr. Lincoln did at Gettysburg and the tide of turning that war into a Union victory that has assured that every American would be guaranteed equal opportunity, fairness, justice, and the kind of security that every American had received before that time. And so when I stand here at Manassas and reflect upon the struggle that our ancestors made, whatever side of the war you might have found yourself on, today we are all the better as a people because we fought it out, we bled it out, and when it was over, we moved on. Still, some questions remain unaddressed, challenges that are still before us. Even as I stand here today, some of the unfinished business of that war was how women were treated and how they will be treated going into the future. Women in our society still make 70 cents to the dollar of what men make, and yet they cannot buy bread cheaper, they cannot pay rent cheaper, they cannot go to the University of Virginia cheaper. They deserve comparable worth, pay equity, and this is the unfinished business of the conflict that took place in this location 138 years ago. The fact that every American is entitled to health care. Here I am, a member of Congress, and whenever I get sick, Bob, I check into a hospital anywhere in the country, indeed anywhere in the world, and I never have to look back on a health care bill or some bill associated with my health, simply because I'm a member of Congress. But I'm an American, If it's good enough for me as a member of Congress, it ought to be good enough for every Virginian. It ought to be good enough for every person from New York. It ought to be good enough for every Illinoisan. It ought to be good enough for everybody. This is the unfinished business of that war. And so we've transformed ourselves from a nation warring on battlefields over critical questions. Should the states have the right or the power to address health care? Should the states advance the cause of women in terms of pay equity? Or should that be the national government's responsibility? Do we want more big government programs that grab Americans who've been left behind while many Americans are participating in unparalleled economic growth? I read just the other day as I prepared to close that Bill Gates and the top 3 officers, for example, at Microsoft, have personal assets of $140 billion. More personal assets than 43 countries and 600 million people. I'd be very interested in seeing what the comparison of their personal assets are to the entire state of Virginia, or to the entire state of Georgia, or to the entire state of Alabama, or to the entire regions of our country that have been economically left behind. These are the unfinished battles that are still before us. Indeed, another generation has come to this location, not only to hallow it, but to pay homage to those on both sides who fought to make America different and to make America better. We are all the more better and all the greater as a nation because men and women paid the ultimate sacrifice that we might change and make our world and our nation better. Thank you, and God bless you all.
Well, I should probably not say anything, but I will. We are now prepared to officially open our visitor center. And so if you'd like to join us, I think there's someone here to orchestrate this. I think we're going around this way and opening the visitor center. So if you would like to join us, we would like to have you join us in opening our visitor center and our bookstore, George. Thank you for coming today. I would like to officially reopen the visitor center and open the new bookstore of Manassas National Battlefield Park. All right.